Well, look what my second best buddy Norman has turned up with today. A lovely CB754 Honda. And if I'm really good, he'll let me ride it. I've owned a couple of CB750s in the past. This one was the last K model, and this one is an F2. The 2 designation was the full fairing version of the F model. Anyway, today I'm out on my Honda NC750 and we're going to compare the two. The old exciting CB750 compared to the newer, boring NC750. It's a weekday and we're taking the normal route up to Jerry's Cafe. The CB's just got the standard exhaust and muffler, so let's hear what it sounds like. Yep, it is quiet. Certainly a lot quieter than his other bikes. But it sounds really quite nice. Unfortunately, the video doesn't really capture the proper sound of the bike. And of course, what you're hearing here is my NC, as Norman follows me on the CB. This particular example of the CB750 is a K3 1973 model. It was originally sourced from the USA, so it's sort of American spec. A couple of slight differences, but mostly the same as what we found in Australia at the time. My NC750 has aftermarket muffler on it, and it sounds really nice. It's only a twin compared to the CB's 4-cylinder, but it's got a 270-degree crank, and it makes it sound really nice on the road. We have arrived at Jerry's Cafe for some morning coffee and maybe even breakfast. After all, Norman deserves a bit of a treat for bringing his little toy out today. It's a Tuesday morning early, so there's not a huge number of people here, which is really nice. But the resident doggies are here to greet us. They recognise us no matter which bike we turn up on, and they know they'll get some handouts. Let's have a closer look at the bikes. The CB's in pretty original condition. It's got the original 4x4 pipes. It's obvious that this is a 4-cylinder engine, something that was not at all common when they first came out in 1969. Unlike today's modern bikes, it's got some nice, easy to read dials. That's all you need. The CB and the NC have more things in common than you might think. Yes, it's got twin shocks, and yes, it's 4-cylinder, but it's got a single front disc, conventional forks, and the NC, single front disc, although the caliper's a little bit better than the old version, standard forks. But unfortunately, it's got one of these crappy LCD screens. I'd much rather the dials on the CB. It's so much easier to read. And the specs are remarkably similar too. Although the CB puts out quite a bit more horsepower at 68 horsepower compared to 54 for the NC. The NC puts out slightly more torque than the CB, and the CB puts out these figures at a lot higher revs. The wet weight of both bikes is very similar. The NC is 220 kilos and the CB is 233. But the seat height is lower on the CB. Anyway, if you're interested in the specs, just pause the video on the relevant spec sheet. It's my turn for riding. I get to ride the CB back home. The first thing you notice when you get on the CB is how small it feels. It does feel a bit wider, but it feels really quite small compared to most modern bikes. This is a pretty common trait. The Z900 Kawasaki that I reviewed earlier also felt quite small compared to a modern bike. But the other thing that you notice immediately is how smooth the motor is. It really is a revelation that a bike this old feels so solid and smooth. This would have been a real shock to riders used to riding British twins that rattled and shaked and dripped oil all over the place. The other thing that's immediately noticeable is how easy it is to ride. With its narrow tyres and relatively low centre of gravity, the bike is really easy to just tip round corners. As I mentioned, it is heavier than the NC and it uses almost twice the amount of fuel. But I don't think any owner of a CB would be worried about that today. The bike has a 5-speed gearbox. And the other thing to notice is how tractable the engine is. It just purrs along in 5th gear and then can easily accelerate without any problems at all. Nice and smooth. This is one of our favourite little bits of twisty road close to home. And of course the GoPro flattens out all the corners. But riding the CB through here is really quite a joy. It's a bit of a revelation to feel that a 1973 motorcycle can go through these corners just as well as my NC can, or any other bike for that matter. I'm sure the nice narrow tyres help in this regard, and I can't understand the trend for wider wheels on road bikes that really don't need that wider rubber. As with the other old bikes that I've reviewed of Norman's, this bike is a joy to ride and really doesn't show its age at all. Its size and seating position are the only things that give it away as being an older bike. Okay, let's have a look at the NC this time. This is a 2016 model, but it hasn't really changed over the years all that much. I've done 85,000 kilometres on this bike now, so I'm relatively happy with its performance. As you saw from the spec sheet, it's no superbike. The term superbike came into common usage with the advent of the CB750. It may seem ordinary now, but compared to the old British 500 and 650 twins, it was a complete revolution. The NC, on the other hand, is really a nod back to the past in some ways. Certainly not revolutionary from a performance point of view. It's only a twin cylinder compared to the CB's 4, and it puts out less horsepower than the CB, but it does have slightly more torque. And the actual feel on the road, it feels more powerful than the CB. And while I wasn't going to actually put them to the physical test, the NC feels as though it accelerates quite a bit quicker than the CB does. And this is why just comparing performance on paper can be a big mistake. While the suspension on the NC's got nothing to write home about, it feels more planted and secure, and it feels more powerful. and it does everything at way lower revs than the CB does. This gives it a real relaxed feel when you're just cruising through the countryside. Having said all that, I have to admit that riding through this twisty section of road, the CB felt just as planted and just as sure and just as fast going around all these corners than the NC did. But as far as comfort goes, the NC certainly has the edge. The seat to peg length on the NC is much greater than the CB, and the CB seat is really quite ordinary compared to the NC's. You tend to sit down in the NC, whereas on the CB you're sort of perched up on top. Of course that could be personal preference, but I like the feel of the NC's seating position better. Which is probably just as well, because I certainly wouldn't be able to afford buying this CB750 now. Those bikes have become very desirable to people of my age who grew up with those bikes when they were just getting their license. Anyway, that's my overview of both these bikes. If you want a more in-depth review of the NC, just go to my channel. I've got heaps of reviews there. And thank you, Norman, for sharing your bike with us.